some playoff defensive strategy, though. So as mentioned, roster spots are so much more precious here in the playoffs, and getting that 1 to 2 defensive punch where you play this defense has a better matchup in week 15 followed by week 16. If you're getting 15 or more points from your defense in your playoffs, that could be the difference between winning a title and not getting to your championship. And I think we've got some really, really clear answers this year in 2023 on which way to go. So I will say first, some defenses to check for that are not out there in 50% of leagues, but there's some reasons for fantasy owners to drop them. The first one would 100% be for me, the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, they're facing Buffalo this week, so I've seen them get dropped in a lot of leagues right now. They get New England in week 15. You don't need me to tell you why that's such a juicy matchup. The Raiders in week 16, 8th most points allowed, and Aiden O'Connell just looser and looser with the ball. And then the Jake Browning-led Bengals in your week 17 championship week. All three of those matchups are great for a defense that, yeah, the last couple of weeks has not been nearly as strong, but over the course of the season, they're still a top 6 unit in points per game. They've been very, very solid, and I think they are a team to definitely the best, just top to bottom, week 15 to 17. All three matchups are good for a very talented defense. So check for your Chiefs, check for your Browns as well. They've had a couple underwhelming weeks and back-to-back ones, but this could be an awesome, awesome streamer to pair up with another one, because in week 15, they get Chicago, 6th most points allowed, 2 defenses. And then week 17, the Jets. What's better than a matchup with the New York Jets? They have been so abysmal these last few games. In fact, since their bye week, the Jets have given up 12, 27, 8, 21, 21, and 17 points to opposing defenses. They have not scored more than 13 points in a single game. So the Jets in your championship week for one of the best defenses in the league, a team that has given up the fewest passing yards, Cleveland will definitely be a potential title swinger if you can get to week 17 with them in that type of matchup. Now, the rub here is in week 16, it does get a little bit uglier there. They get Houston, and we know how good CJ Stroud has been, but there's plenty of opportunities to stash maybe the Commanders, who get the Jets we were just talking about in week 16. They're out there in every league, the Commanders. So maybe you can pair those two up, go back-to-back, facing the Jets. It's a winning strategy this year. Go for that if you're looking for a first check defense. You also got the Jets, though, as a very solid defense. They're also top 7 in fantasy points. They still haven't quite quit on their team, which is great. They get Miami in week 15. You don't want to use them then. But in week 16, Washington, who we know is giving up the most sacks in the league, the 3rd most points to defenses. And then Cleveland themselves, Joe Flacco, sure, this offense looked better with him, but we saw that interception he threw. It's not by any means a turnover-proof team. This is a team that could definitely swallow up Cleveland in your championship week as well. 79% rostered, but given that they hit Houston and Miami these next 2 weeks, we could see the Jets get dropped by a lot of teams. And then Philadelphia, 72% roster, but they get the Cowboys this week. Maybe we see them get dropped ahead of the fantasy playoffs, where they get Seattle, a mediocre matchup, but then Arizona, or New York Giants, rather, the most points allowed to defenses, and then Arizona, a top 10 matchup for defenses as well. So those are some teams to first check for. I will say this. I've got a team that I would have, they're out there in 70% of leagues, that I would pick up even ahead of all of those teams. We're going to get to them in a second. The team that I consider the cheat code of your fantasy playoffs. But the other strategy you can make sure to double check is who's playing the Pats, Jets, Panthers, and Giants. Those teams have been a potential 20-point blow-up for teams on your defensive radar. So just to quickly summarize who's facing those teams, for your Patriots, they get the Chiefs in week 15, as we mentioned, and then Denver, 37% rostered. So again, if you have the Browns defense and you don't want to face Houston, pick up Denver, who gets the Patriots in that week. The Denver Broncos do get the Chargers and Detroit Lions otherwise, so not a great spot in those, but getting the Patriots at home in week 16, a defense that's been 9, 9, and 10 points before facing Houston this last week. They've been playing really solid ball, so I think the Broncos could be a sneaky semifinal stash, especially if you have a bye week. Definitely a team to look for. The Patriots then get the Bills, 73% roster. That could be a league winner in week 17 as well. Who's facing the Jets? Miami, 91% roster, so probably not out there for you. But if they are, boom, week 15 against the Jets. Then we got the Commanders that we talked about, 18% roster, another plug and play in your semifinals. A lot of potential streaming options out there in your semifinal weeks. And then week 17, Cleveland, as mentioned, against the Jets, a team that has not scored more than 13 points since their bye week 8 weeks ago. has given up 20-plus points in half of their games to defenses. So that could be Cleveland, would be a monster. But the Commanders in week 16, a potential plug-and-play. Who's facing the Giants, the most points allowed to defenses on the season. The Saints in week 15, then the Eagles in week 16, and then the Rams, 36% rostered. They get the Giants in week 17 as well. Definitely a team that has the pass rush to get after a team that's given up the most sacks in the league besides the Commanders. Could be a good spot as well. And then who's facing Carolina? Atlanta, they're on the road. They get the Panthers. The Green Bay on the road gets the Panthers again. And then the Jags at home in week 17. They're 74% roster, so probably not out there, but both Atlanta and Green Bay out there in a lot of leagues. They could also be plug and plays in weeks 15 and 16, respectively. So that's one way to attack your playoffs. But maybe you just want defenses with good matchups all the way through. Let's summarize a couple of those for you, but then get to my cheat code defense. Then again, this is the answer to the test. This is the one defense you need. First, though, the Rams, as we just mentioned, they get Baltimore in week 14. Not a great spot, so they're probably going to be out there, 36% rostered. Then they get Washington in week 15 at home, third most points in defenses. New Orleans probably playing Jameis Winston, a turnover machine there in week 16. And then, as mentioned, the Giants in week 17 for your Rams. That is a great 3-week stretch for a defense that has, been vastly mediocre this year, but they still have Aaron Donald and a good D-line that can pressure the quarterback. They still have okay corners that have made plays and turnovers before. So this is a defense that could get hot at the right time. I like looking at them. I also love Green Bay, who's a good play this week. They get the Giants in week 14. After that, Tampa Bay at home. Baker Mayfield's arm looks like it is just deflating right before our eyes. And then they get Carolina, the 5th most points in your semifinals, and then Minnesota with Josh Dobbs looking like that is turning into a pumpkin quite fast. That's the 9th most points allowed to defenses. So the 5th most points, the 9th most points in your semis and your championship week make Green Bay at only 19% rostered a very good potential spot as well. I also maybe consider it, as mentioned, they get Carolina, 5th most points to defenses. They get the Colts in week 16, not the top spot in my opinion, but then Chicago in week 17, also a pretty good spot, 6th most points allowed to defenses. And Chicago themselves get a pretty good schedule here with Cleveland, the 7th most points in week 15, Arizona, the 10th most points, and then Atlanta, the 11th most points, all potential options for you. But as I was teasing Wolfpack, there is a defensive cheat code. There is a team that I think could absolutely swing leagues. And the best part is they have a good week 14 matchup, so you could even use them this week as well. And who is that team? Look no further than the Indianapolis Colts. 31% rostered out there in nearly 70% of leagues. And I think they are going to swing titles this year. Just look at their last 4 games. 26, 16, 11, and 18 fantasy points in their last 4 games. They are the number 3 defense in fantasy points on the year, but even better, they're the number 1 team in that 4-week span by a mile. 17.5 fantasy points per game in those last 4. That is 5 more points more than the next closest team to them. They have in that span an absurd 21 sacks across those 4 games. That's 5.25 sacks, 3 defensive touchdowns, nearly 1 per game. 9 takeaways, over 2 takeaways per game in that span. And who do they get in your fantasy playoffs? The Trubisky-led Steelers at home. Desmond Ridder on the road in week 16. Pathetic. And then at home again for Aiden O'Connell and the Raiders. That is all 3 top 10 matchups that are even better when you consider how bad these quarterbacks are, these replacement level guys coming in. I think the Indianapolis Colts, based on how hot they're entering your playoffs, plus the matchups that they've got coming up, are so good. And then you also get them in week 14 facing Jake Browning on the road, a really, really good spot for your Colts there. So they've been a complete and utter cheat code for these last 4 weeks, and they've got the schedule to continue doing so through your fantasy playoffs. I think they're worth a good, solid fab bid here to lock them in at minimum so you're not facing them, but to definitely use against your opponents here. The Indianapolis Colts are far and away my number 1 defensive ad of 2023 fantasy playoffs. What is up, you fantasy wolf? Thanks so much for tuning in. If you haven't already, share your thoughts in the comments, check out some more videos, and join the newest Wolfpack by subscribing below.